So what we're doing today is we have a webinar that we put together through Southeastern Michigan ACCA, and we wanted to give the contractors of Michigan some insight into what some of the changes are going forward with the state reopening. There's a lot of uncertainty and a lot of new rules and regulations to play by, and we put together a panel of experts to give you some insight, give you some resources, and really some knowledge in order to figure out ways that you can conduct your business going forward safely and compliantly. That way you're covering your employees and you're covering yourself and your own liabilities and making sure that you have the best knowledge going forward. So we have on this panel today, we have Daniel Squires, Dirk Beamer, Brian Hare, and Matt Bergstrom. I'm Colleen Keyworth from Online Access and Southeastern Michigan ACCA, and Matt Bergstrom and I both serve on the board for Southeastern Michigan ACCA, and we kind of have put this together as an entire team trying to get some information together. We have lots of great stuff to cover. We're going to be covering a lot about the Payroll Protection Act. We're going to be covering a lot over PPE and state guidelines for opening, going over the Executive Order 2020-97, where we have to talk about reopening businesses and what guidelines you have to have in place to do that. So we're going to go around the panel, if you were, and we're going to have all of our panelists introduce themselves. We're going to start with Brian Hare, and we're going to work our way from that to Daniel, Dirk, and then Matt.
Okay, thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Brian Hare. I'm the managing partner of Hare CPAs and Business Advisors in Auburn Hills. And we're CPAs and business consultants for small, medium-sized business. And as of recent, my new title is PPP Expert. I'm hoping to shed that title in the next couple months, but at least that's the interim title. They haven't given us an acronym yet, but if they did, I'm sure I would have it and pass the exam. I'm happy to be here and happy to help everyone.
So you can put CPA, PPP, and all of those extra. Yeah, okay. Yeah, Daniel Squires, Vincent's Heating and Plumbing, and contractor for many years, and here to offer whatever help that I can.
I'm Dirk Beamer. I am the managing shareholder at Wright Beamer. We are business lawyers located in Farmington Hills. We work with primarily privately held companies throughout Southeast Michigan and beyond. My background is in employment law, management side, and business law more generally. And like all of you, we've been working diligently to keep up with the rapidly changing rules. So not only have we had to keep up with new legislation, but we've also had to make sure we know how to use all the tools that Zoom offers. That's a whole nother set of skills that we can put on our resumes. So happy to be with you and share some insight in terms of how you reopen, what you need to do to be reopening, and what executive orders and other things you have to keep in mind.
And hello all, I'm Matt Bergstrom, Thornton & Grooms, Metro Detroit area contractor. We do primary residential service repair replace, so we've kind of been in that world, been in the home world, and been working through this whole deal, and have been leaning a lot on our attorney and our CPA and helping to get answers as we've walked through this. So they've been incredibly helpful in helping us out that way. Also on the board of Michigan ACCA, or Southeastern Michigan ACCA, and have found that to be a great tool as well. So welcome all, and Colleen, kick us off here.
All right. So without any further ado, we have some questions we put aside, but I want to encourage all the attendees, please put your questions in the questions and answer section or use the chat. We're going to have a recording later that we're going to be able to share with membership and send on an email and stuff. But if you have specific questions that you want covered or you want answers to, we would love to hear from you. So I encourage you, please take advantage of those tools. And if you don't have anything to add, we're just going to continue with some of the stuff that we have going forward. Feel free to interrupt with questions at any time. So right now with the payroll protection loans, we are kind of seeing where most businesses have already secured their loans. And now we're getting into people have their loans and people are coming back to work, and there's even new rules and guidelines. Brian, would you rather to kind of expand upon that for me, please?
Will do. I'll spend just a little bit of time talking about what happened last week, and then what we think is going to happen over the next coming weeks. Submit your questions. I'll apologize in advance if I give the typical CPA answer on all your questions, which is it depends. So, you know, that might be the answer. But I'm going to read off in a minute just my cliff notes of the main points. But going into that, what's really important to understand is the PP Flex Act of last week. All that did was change the CARES Act. What has to happen now over the next couple weeks is both the U.S. Department of Treasury and the Small Business Administration have to go back now and rewrite all their guidance that they previously wrote. And what we've learned from the CARES Act and some of the guidance, including the application itself that came out, is the SBA and the Department of Treasury may not necessarily do exactly what Congress intended. They're gonna interpret the rules how they want. They also have to look at other laws out there to make sure that they're not in any violation of the laws. So the good news is every time they do and enact new rules, it tends to get more clear, easier for business owners to understand, and very, very pro business. But we have to wait another week until we're going to get even more guidance. So stay tuned for that. So getting into it, here's the cliff notes. I'm just going to read off my sheet here so we can get through it quickly. First thing to note is that now there's under the original CARES Act, we had 2 years to repay the loan. Now we have up to 5 years. And one thing that's really important to note is business owners that got loans already that were written for 2 years, they're going to have to work with your banks to get them extended now to 5. It's not automatic where we all just get 5 years. So paycheck protection loans that have not gone out yet will be 5 years. Other ones that were 2, the loans will have to be redrafted. We see no reason why the banks wouldn't do that if you want a 5-year loan. Now they've extended the 8-week cover period up to 24 weeks. And that would really take us to the end of 2020. It is an election. You can take the 8 weeks or you can take the 24 weeks. What's really important and a lot of questions that we're getting right now as it relates to that, and something to think about as an owner, is getting into some of the formulas and how your forgiveness might be reduced. And the primary one being your full-time equivalent headcount. And what we're hearing now is, well, if we go into a recession, and we hear maybe today we're in a recession according to the media, we go into a recession and we have to start to reduce our workforce in December. And we opted for the 24 weeks. Are we now going to lose some forgiveness because we opted to go for that 24-week period rather than the 8-week period? And right now, my interpretation with how the law is written is, yes, that's exactly what would happen. If you have to reduce your workforce for non-COVID related purposes, maybe just a normal decline in your business or seasonality or whatever it might be, then yes, definitely there's going to be there could be some loss of forgiveness. However, still reading it though, I think that we will be able to choose, do we want the 8-week or do we want the 24-week? And I think that's going to be a benefit, and Treasury, they're going to say, choose whatever's best for you. So what we're advising now is do everything you can to maximize the 8-week. Let's still try to get it done within 8 weeks rather than stretching it to 24. But if that doesn't work, let's use the 24 and then we'll figure it out later. Really, really important concept though. Also within there, as everybody probably knows already, we had to use at least 75% of our PPP money on payroll costs. They've now changed that to 60%. Though written in there though, and it's a little ambiguous, but now it appears to be a cliff. Meaning if we don't use at least 60% of our money on payroll, we lose all forgiveness. Before it was kind of a reduction formula where you would look at what you did spend on payroll and then you would kind of back into what you were allowed to spend on non-payroll. Now how it's written, we're interpreting it as you got to spend at least 60%. So, and we're also interpreting that would include within the 8-week period. So if we're going to use the 8-week covered period, we still have to look and make sure we spend at least 60%. Really, really critical to plan around that. Also, they put in 2 exceptions now for achieving the forgiveness under the full-time equivalent headcount. And, really what those exceptions are is, one of them is, what happens if I ask somebody to come back from unemployment and they choose not to? Am I going to be penalized? Under the CARES Act, there was no relief for us if that were to happen. Subsequent to that, though, the Treasury Department did offer guidance, and they were going to give some relief, but they put that in the in the Flexibility Act. So the answer is, if you document it the right way, in writing, and you can prove it, and an employee chooses not to come back, then you will not be penalized. Also, if you have a circumstance, and we really don't know what's going to happen later this year, but if you have a circumstance where you cannot bring back all of your people due to COVID, and you can prove that, and it is related to COVID, you will not be penalized under the full-time equivalent headcount. So those are two really, really big things that they wrote in. Then another thing within the original CARES Act is the deferral. If anything falls to a loan, you are able to defer your loan payments for up to 6 months from when you originally received your loan. Now what's happening is the deferral period is going to, and I'm just reading this, it's going to be deferred now. Your loan payments will be deferred until when your bank actually receives permission to forgive your loan by the SBA. So they replaced the 6-month deferral period with, you have to wait, and when the bank gets its money back from the SBA and gives full forgiveness, that's when our loan payments are going to start. And then the last and pretty significant change is under the CARES Act, there was another benefit in there where we could defer payment of our Social Security and Medicare taxes. The employer portion of Social Security and Medicare tax, we could defer that between now and the end of the year, and we could pay 1/2 of that at the end of 2021 and 1/2 at the end of 2022. There was a clause in there, though, that said if I got paycheck protection money, I was no longer able to, and I got forgiveness, if I got forgiveness, I was no longer able to defer, and they've changed that. You can now do both. You can defer your payroll taxes and you can get paycheck protection forgiven. So that's the major changes. I do have one other kind of question out there that's unanswered, and under the normal 8-week covered period, you couldn't pay any one person more than $15,384. And that would be a general, whether it was an owner or a non-owner. $15,384 is the most you could pay. If you paid more, you'd lose forgiveness. They're going to have to define that, because right now how it's written, I believe that it's still written in a way where you can't give somebody more than $15,384 now in a 24-month period. So it's just one of those semantics. They're going to have to just kind of fix it through the rulings. And I anticipate, with 99% confidence that they will reword it and just change it and say, look, you just have to make sure that what you're paying people and you annualize it, you don't, on an annualized basis, you don't pay them more than $100,000 a year. But that's still, from planning purposes, that still opens questions about, well, is it better to do the 8-week period because maybe I want to pay the owners more than an annualized $100,000. So, there's little questions in there. So stay tuned. It will all be clarified, I think, in the next 2 weeks. And I think that when it is clarified, it will make it easier to administer, and it will be very, very pro-business. I'm optimistic about the guidance that's coming. Every time they give us new guidance, it becomes easier for us and better for us.
Well, it sounds like most of the changes that came through were much needed. I know that we were concerned about addressing, especially when it comes to employment coming back full time. I wanted to kind of brush on some of that with both Dan and Matt and see if you guys have some of your experience to share as far as what you've been doing with your loan, and as far as how you address some of your employees, if you had any issues with them coming back to work, what was your game plan for tracking to keep track of that, and if you guys did unfortunately have any situations where somebody did refuse to come back, and what that looked like from a standpoint that you were able to track it properly to make sure that you were covered. Starting with Matt.
Oh, wow. Yeah, this has been a big topic and a big worry for us, I think. I think what we did and what we tried to do through the process was just keep in contact with our employees. When this whole thing started, we allowed voluntary leaves, and because we didn't really understand it, know what was going on. But as we moved more and more through it, we found that the easiest thing was just to have a good, fair, frank conversation with our team. And a lot of it just revolved around, hey, you're out there using essential workers every day, whether you go to the grocery store, 7-Eleven, get your gas, any of those positions, and we're being called to duty to be an essential worker too. So we've really tried to work with our team around that, and most every single one of our employees answered the call. There were a few that decided to that it was better for them to be able to take a summer vacation and get the pay, and we just simply said, we're not gonna contest it, but we're also gonna write on the paperwork when it comes to us that you were recalled back to work and decided not to come back to work. Wherever that goes from there, I don't know, but that's your call, and that worked for a couple of people, and we had a couple of people that came back and worked the system a little bit and ended up getting themselves fired per se, so that they could do it. But if that's how you want to work, that's how you want to work. So that's kind of how we worked the process. And it's been pretty successful for us. So.
What we did was right from the beginning. I was a little two things. I was suspicious a little bit with this bonus unemployment money as to how that would all work. And then the second thing is that, we were still in the winter season where we had a lot of essential work that was still coming in. And so what I opted to do was, and the other factor was that I have an on-call schedule where I have a rotation of who comes in at certain times. And I was very concerned that if I laid people off, that I would not be able to, that I'd be dumping all the on-call onto, a few willing horses and then ride them to death. And I didn't want to do that. So I took a different course. What I did was I decided not to lay anybody off. And instead, in anticipation of the PPP money, which I didn't get till the second round, I was originally hooked up with a larger bank that, I don't know that they ever served all their customers. But what I did in anticipation of that was I opted to pay my people to do online training that I got a hold of, like Go Time, training that's available through Service Roundtable, and they had a tremendous amount of training, and I had a lead person on that verifying the amount of times that various modules should take, and then they had to report to that person, so that we would be able to pay them, and so between doing online training. And we caught just about every online training that manufacturers and people had available, and then the technical training that we had people signed up for. We kept everybody busy during that time period until I finally got that word on May 1st that we were going to be able to open up on the 7th to begin to do expanded things that we'd had to cut off. And so that was my approach to it. And, hearing some of the things, as to the difficulties that other employers have had, I'm really glad I opted to do it that way. And I have a better educated, better trained workforce now too.
Good point. Well used time. Brian, you'd mentioned keeping track of it was important. As far as what are some of the best ways to keep track of how you're using the loan to make sure that you're, first off, being able to track where it's going, and then you had resources that you were going to recommend. What would you?
Yep, I'm gonna jump just quickly to a guide that I have. So first, I'll say on the resources, and Colleen, when we end the Zoom meeting, I'm going to send over a couple of links to you, and you can send them out to your members. But
You can also put them in the chat too, if you want.
Okay. So one thing that I'll send over is the American Institute of CPAs has a workbook that it appears they've spent extensive time putting together the workbook that will do all the calculations. I'm sure they're frantically updating it for the Flexibility Act. But I'm going to send you the link, and you can, we can send that out. We've got clients that are already filling it out. We filled it out ourselves. It's pretty accurate. I haven't found any problems with it. And so that's going to be a great resource for everybody to use as far as going through and doing all the calculations. Definitely talk to your attorneys and your CPAs. And you'll connect your financial lead. These calculations sometimes can be confusing. It's good to have a second set of eyes on it. Let's be honest, this is real money too. This is forgiven money. So the whole idea is utilize the team, utilize your resources to get it done the right way. And then probably most important for everybody is to lean on their bank. The banks are getting ready. I do believe the banks are going to be giving seminars. And the reason I say that is what we learned through the application process, I think, is going to stand true again. Different banks are going to do it differently. I've read through this. I've talked to different banks, and there's enough flexibility in there where we're going to see inconsistencies with the banks. So really, really critical for everybody that got loans to sit on their webinars from their primary lender that they got the PPP through, and do the forgiveness how the bank instructs them to do it. However, I'll also say we had to fight a lot of banks, and we won where we thought that the banks were administering it the wrong way. And I'll say in the biggest case, we actually had our client had the executive vice president from Bank of America call him with a personal apology. Because we just kept saying the bank is wrong, the bank is wrong, the bank is wrong, and the email fed itself up through the channel, and we could not believe it. But we don't discredit the banks. They're not doing anything wrong. They're trying to learn just like the rest of us, and this is kind of a community effort. So if it doesn't look right, what you're hearing from the bank, challenge them on it, or have your financial leader, your attorney, or your CPA challenge them. Okay, as far as the documentation. What we're recommending to our clients is work with your financial people, your internal accountants, and set up your accounting system in a way where you as an owner can go to the financial lead in your business and say, in 5 minutes, I want you to give me a report and show me how much PPP money I've spent and where it got spent. And so some of the ways that we can set up our accounting systems, first would be within the accounting system, you can set up a class. And as you're using the money, you can post your transactions to a class system. That's one way to do it. We've had some clients that have created entirely separate general ledger accounts. I don't necessarily recommend that, but you can. Some clients have put the money in a separate bank account. And what they're doing is, as they're spending the money, they're either drafting directly against that new bank account, or they're pulling the money out directly after. We don't recommend that. We think that's too much documentation at this point. We really don't think that they're going to care. The key to the whole thing on the documentation is they're going to ask for, as far as it relates to all of your employment costs, your payroll costs, they're going to ask for payroll journals, payroll ledgers. They're going to ask for proof of payments. So typically within the payroll costs, your payroll provider is going to be providing most of those reports. And we know some of the larger ones like ADP, Paychex, and Payroll One already within their software have a special report that you can run. You can just print that report with the date range. Some of the smaller and other payroll companies are still getting their systems ready, but you'll have to lean on your payroll company to do that. As far as how do you document your full-time equivalent, it's going to be through your payroll company and then your own internal records. So be ready with that. And some banks are going to require that you submit that documentation. Other banks we're anticipating, they're going to ask for nothing at all. They're going to ask for a simple couple-page application and say, just have the other documents ready. And if we happen to want them or the SBA wants them, we'll ask for them then. But you still are going to have to be ready with those documentations. As far as the non-payroll costs, you're going to need, you will need bills, and you're going to need canceled checks. So you're going to want to show first that you did have a business expense and that you paid the business expense. One thing that's going to be important is a lot of us are paying rent either for our facilities or possibly you might have vehicles in a leasing company. In order to get forgiveness on any rent payments, they are going to ask for a copy of the rent agreement. So if you don't have a rent agreement in place, talk to your attorney, make sure that you get one drafted and executed. And it's got to be a rent agreement that was enforced before February 15th. I'm not going to comment on, well, what if we don't have one and backdate it? I think that's everybody's own comfort level. I think now, for me, my recommendation would be, because we can go out 24 weeks, there's no reason to get aggressive on anything. Just spend the money on payroll costs and just call it a day. But if you do have that, and especially if you want to use it in an 8-week, as long as it was an agreement that was enforced by February 15th, you're good. You will submit that. My understanding is it doesn't matter if it's related party, third party. Doesn't matter. It's just a written rent agreement. And then also no prepayments on anything. So you can't prepay rent, you can't prepay mortgage interest, anything like that. So it's costs that you incurred and paid. Last thing I'll say, because this is also really critical and it's kind of confusing. They talk about incurred and paid as it relates to getting to the end of the covered period. And they talk about for both payroll costs and non-payroll costs. And what that means is if the end of your covered period is in the middle of a natural cycle, a natural billing cycle, and the example that they use is maybe it's your utility bill, and your utility cycle, your 30-month cycle is cut right in the middle with the end of your covered period. You don't have to rush and try to pay, say, a 15 days worth of utilities within your covered period. They say if it happens naturally, and as long as you pay that utility bill when it's naturally due, you'll still get forgiveness. So let's say it was right in the middle, you would get 15 days of forgiveness as long as you paid that utility bill when it was naturally due, even if it was outside the covered period. And that would be the same. That would be the same thing for your payroll costs, as long as your payroll is either paid weekly or every 2 weeks. That if your covered period ends in the middle of a pay period, you don't have to rush and try to get your employees paid within that 8-week window or the 24-week window. As long as you pay them directly after when the pay cycle naturally ends, you'll still get forgiveness even though it was paid outside that window. And then the last thing is probably important is that your covered period you have a choice on when to start your covered period. Either your covered period starts when you received your loan disbursement, or if you pay weekly or bi-weekly, your covered period can start on the same day as your first payroll, beginning after you received your loan. But that's only for weekly and bi-weekly pay.
No, thank you, Brian. That's a lot and a lot of great information, especially when it comes to keeping track. I didn't even think about the outside sources outside of payroll, like your utilities and building.
Yeah.
You had some links to share. I definitely can share them with the group afterwards, but while you're on here, if you want to put them in the chat, that might be some instant resources that some of the attendees can actually click on right now. If you just paste them in there. Thank you so much. The second half of this call was kind of talking about where we were going to get into opening state up. Now that a lot of us obviously have been working through this and had our techs in the field, maybe had some limited office staff in, maybe had most of them working remotely, but now that the state's reopening, a lot of people are coming back into the office, and that means new guidelines according to the newest executive order. And with that, we're getting into your response plan, getting into what you have for your daily cleaning habits, mask wear, what your PPE policy is, and what you're going to do for employee screening. And so we have Dirk Beamer here from Beamer, and I forget Wright, was I crazy wrong on that? Beamer and Wright. Wright Beamer, sorry, and he was going to actually give us some insight based on what the legality is. And the biggest thing we're going to see, guys, and no matter what we're doing in business, is we have to be able to cover ourselves as far as liability, because it's a new world. And even though some of us might be feeling pent up and this is kind of getting ridiculous and everything, but there's so much out there that we don't know and so much changing. And the bottom line is that we're liable at the end of the day until things change. And so we have to protect ourselves, protect our business, and protect our employees. And we hope that the next couple questions that we have, and as we go through steps, Dirk's going to share some of his knowledge, and Daniel and Matt are going to also share to that what practices they've put in place for their companies. So Dirk, as far as the first step with the response plan, I know we have our own, and this is for my company, Online Access. This is lots and lots and lots of wonderful that our insurance company gave us a template, and we were able to fill out kind of what that looked like. But as a practical, actually implementing that plan, can you kind of speak to that as far as what you're seeing and what the top takeaways people need to have from what they need to have in place before people come back?
Sure. Yeah. Thank you, Colleen. So as Colleen indicated, as we're reopening, we know that we do have obligations as employers. A lot of us probably may now have seen snippets of Executive Order 2020-97, which was the first comprehensive statement issued by the governor's office and laying out what was going to be expected at a more general reopening. That has been replaced as of last Friday by 2020-114. So there's state-of-the-art guidance out there, and it is a little bit different. It's largely the same as 97, but it's a little bit more expansive, and importantly, it includes some specific requirements for in-home service providers. So if as I assume most or all of you are, certainly if you're doing residential work, you need to be familiar with those additional requirements that are going to govern part of your preparedness plan. A couple things to keep in mind about the plan is, as Colin said, we do this to keep our people safe. We do this to be compliant with the law, and that has two real significant ramifications, at least from my mind. One is that the order says itself that if you don't comply, you are deemed not compliant with the OSHA requirement to maintain a workplace that is free from a risk of death or serious bodily injury. So just by not complying with this order, you're automatically deemed to not be in compliance with OSHA. That can have some serious ramifications, serious penalties, and also is a basis by which an employee can say, I'm not coming to work. And you can't take action against me, and I'm eligible for unemployment because you don't operate a safe workplace. So from a very practical level, you need to have your plan in place and you need to follow it. The other obvious response is, a lot of concern about what is the potential liability out there for employers, especially if, heaven forbid, somebody contracts COVID-19 and they want to try to pin it on your workplace. My personal view is that if you do the right things, it's very difficult to establish that connection, but you're going to make it a whole lot easier for somebody to say that you're not maintaining a safe workplace or that you're being negligent if you're not even bothering to follow the steps that are lined out by the state and part of the executive order telling you how to operate. So a lot of good reasons why you need to try to comply. So you have to have a plan document itself. You have a lot of options available. Like Colleen said, your insurance company is going to have stuff available for you. SHRM has stuff available. What I tell people is this does not need to be a masterpiece. You just need to make sure you've followed the dots that are laid out pretty clearly in the executive order itself, and you speak to them. It gives you a list of things that you're expected to address. You got to get those on paper, how you're going to handle them. And that's really what the first step is. You have to have somebody who's responsible and on site all the time, who is familiar with the plan and can enforce the plan. And you also have to give training to the plan. You have to make sure people understand what's expected of them. I tell people all the time, in employment law, the only thing worse than not having written policies is when you have a written policy and you don't follow it. So that's the same here with your preparedness plan. You've got to be prepared to implement it and to expect people to stand up and abide by it. And a conversation that we have had with our own employees is, look, there's all sorts of reasons we're doing this. We're doing it to keep people safe. We're doing it because it's the law. We're also doing it because we understand that people have different comfort levels. Somebody may think this is a bunch of malarkey and is a waste of time. somebody may be scared to death to leave their house and come to work every day. I think this is critically important to keep them safe. So no matter where you are on the spectrum, if nothing else, then as a courtesy to your coworkers, you gotta pitch in and follow the plan. If you haven't read the order itself yet, you go to mich.gov, click the coronavirus tab. It'll give you the option to click on executive orders and directives and scroll through. Click on EO 2020-114 and read through and see the various requirements. But some of the big things are, again, you have to have the plan in place within 2 weeks of reopening. For a lot of you, that means you ought to have it in place already. You have to have that supervisor. You have to have your screening protocol for people reporting to work that minimally asks about symptoms and also about exposure. We had some conversation.
Dirk, I just shared the, sorry to interrupt you.
Yeah.
I just shared the link to that page just so you guys can reference. It's in the chat. That actually shows you the executive order, and it'll go through all the new steps and all the new guidelines for opening businesses, and especially when it comes to service area or, you know, in-home service businesses. So that link's in there, and go ahead. I just wanted to make sure that people knew that they could reference that.
Oh, that's great. That's excellent. Just so I don't forget, I would also encourage everybody to also take a look back at EO 2020-36, and that speaks to the prohibition against retaliation against employees with COVID-related conditions. That's still in force, and frankly, it's a rather expansive set of guidelines and gives people a lot of latitude to seek to be absent from work because they are symptomatic. So don't forget about that one, and also don't forget about 2020-76, which deals with unemployment and the fact that someone is unemployment eligible if they have immunocompromised symptoms or conditions. So even though in general we're saying, hey, come back, and even though in general, if you offer somebody a return to work and they don't take it, that makes them ineligible for unemployment, there are some exceptions out there. So looking at your plan, again, screening, a daily screening is important. You have to have a protocol in place. We were talking amongst ourselves before we started this call as to what the different options are. There's software that you can do. Ideally, you have somebody who's an HR function who's facilitating this, so that on the one hand, you can verify that you have required people to screen, but on the other hand, you're making sure that that screening process is kept as confidential as possible. Importantly, temperature check is a question that you should ask. The executive order doesn't require that you separately do that temperature check, but the EEOC has been very clear that that is permissible. So it is my recommendation that you go ahead, and if possible, you go ahead and do that because you're not deemed to be violating anybody's HIPAA or privacy rights in doing that. Also, the order doesn't speak to whether or not visitors have to go through a screening, but certainly there's no restriction on that. And my general recommendation is that you at least think through your visitor policy and what your protocols are for how you're going to handle third parties coming into the workplace, and consider putting a screening in place for them. But what it does require relative to in-home work is that you take the customer essentially through a screening questionnaire, and you don't send your employee into a household until that household has verified that they have the same satisfied the same symptom-free requirements that your workplace does. It also requires that you try to communicate electronically as much as possible. So whether that's by phone or text, minimize in-person contact between your employee and the customer who's receiving the service. Make sure obviously that they have personal protection equipment. The order in general says you need to make, minimally you have to have masks available for everybody. And I'm going to suggest to you that maybe masks are going to be the hardest practical thing to implement because you're supposed to make them available, and you're supposed to require that they be worn in any enclosed public space. You can have a little bit of debate about what that means, but I think certainly it means hallways, bathrooms, workrooms, and maybe most difficult that you have to think through is meeting space. If you have people gathering collectively in a conference room, or you're sitting around a table and doing meeting, I think there's a good argument you need to either be wearing a mask or have shields or have some other implementation to be complying with the executive order.
All right. Well, we have let's pause real quick because there's a lot in there so far. I know you have a lot more to share, so we'll definitely get to the second half of this. But before we kind of get into more, looking at some of this, I know as it seems cumbersome, for my office, for instance, we just had to go through all of our protocols. If, for instance, we have time and daily times that we have to wipe different surfaces down and make sure that we're using cleaning products, whether that be antibacterial wipes or an alcohol solution, keeping public areas safe. In addition to that, we have social distancing guidelines. All of our offices, people are spaced out differently. The masks were provided, but, you know, again, most people don't want to wear them. That's the hardest thing to enforce. And I guess my question, I'm definitely going to be talking to Dan and Matt as far as some of their experiences with their offices. But my question first and foremost is, what do we foresee, or what do you foresee, Dirk? I know you can't see all, but I know most people on the call are like, okay, so I do all this stuff, I go through all this, but after a while, it becomes complacent, because just like anything, everybody wants to get back to normal. And you could still have somebody that, you know, is uncomfortable with it. But for the most part, you have a lot of office employees that just get back into a normal routine, and complacency happens. What is the worst case scenario that we're looking at? Are there going to be OSHA spies? What's the thing that you would warn against as far as complacency, and like, what's the worst case scenario that could happen to a business as far as negligence on these practices?
Well, again, I think the very worst case scenario that we might imagine is if, unfortunately, an employee becomes sick, and certainly if someone became fatally ill with COVID-19 and had a basis or tried to create a basis or find a basis to pin that exposure on your workplace, any breakdown in your system and in your preparedness plan, and in particular, if it's a repetitive laxity on your part, is just going to give fodder to, to a plaintiff's lawyer who's going to try to seek to pin that on you. Now, there's been talk that maybe at some point Congress would extend some immunity or liability protection, but that hasn't happened. And frankly, that conversation seems to have died down. Hopefully you already have been in conversation with your insurance provider and you understand what your coverages are. But if you've ever experienced litigation, you know that it is a major distraction and a major expense, even if you've got coverage, even if you're not found liable. So it's certainly something you'd want to avoid. I would say on a maybe a less serious but still problematic basis, you're going to have to manage this workplace, and you're going to have to manage these competing expectations of the people on the one hand who say, come on already, no one's doing this at the grocery store anymore, no one's doing it at the park, and I don't feel like I need to do it. Someone else who says, hey, my husband is immunocompromised and I don't want to be taking this home to him. I think this is serious. So just for your own ease of management, if you kind of take a hard line early, it's like everything. It's like parenting. You set the ground rules early, and if you're consistent, it's going to be easier for you.
No, that's a really good point. I think that's the picture I wanted to paint for everybody, as far as it's so easy to get caught up in some semblance of normalcy, and yet knowing that this is something that can catch you off guard, and if you're not diligent about it, because it's so natural for us to fall back into, normal habits. One of the other things we were kind of talking about before we get into some of screening stuff, because I know employee screening, if you guys just serve some context for those of you listening, employee screening is recommended by OSHA nationally. However, there are only a handful of states, Michigan, of course, being one of them, that actually require you to do so to have an open business. So there are some serious things that we need to discuss with employee screening, but before we do that, I definitely want to talk to Dan and Matt. Dan, starting with you, as far as what are some of the, your safety preparedness plan? What did you do with your guys working in the field, and then also with your office crew?
Well, I want to pick up right on what Dirk had just talked about, if I could, and that is that as far as you know, what you do to have the people in compliance. One of the things that that I had to do, and you know, I could just call it marketing, but you know, I'm marketing to my internal clients, which are my employees. And so, you know, there was some, you know, I understood what happened with 2020-70 as far as us being able to come back to work. But, you know, I had some rumbling, you know, with some of my people that I was calling back as to what are we doing? Should we be doing this? And I realized that I had to go back and just take them through all the steps. And so what I did was about a week and a half later, I held a Zoom service meeting. That's our new service meetings because we can't get together. I held a Zoom service meeting where I had a PowerPoint prepared of that executive order 2020-70, and I went point by point down through how we are doing this for compliance. I first told my employees that yes, we are legal. This is the executive order, and so it provided the proof to them that there, you know, there was all of that, you know, all of the dumpster talk out there, you know, back and forth, you know, on the text messaging. What are we doing? Why is he bringing us back here, and so forth? So I had to go back to the very beginning and take them point by point, exactly answering how we were in compliance with all of these things, so that I could put an end to that going forward. So now I'm at the point, and I'm going to have another one of my Zoom service meetings tomorrow morning where I'm going to be going and reiterating some of the things about the personal, you know, the social distancing that needs to go on, and that they need to be having the mask. I'm going to show them that it's not me that's saying this, but it's the governor that is requiring this, and of course OSHA behind that. And so, you know, and Matt indicated, you know, earlier how important that communication was. And to me, this is the only way to be able to do this, is just to, you know, step aside and say, it's not me that's making you guys do this. You know, it's the governor, it's OSHA, you know, that is making us comply with all of this. So I think that's an important component of this, is just being really clear as to, you know, so that your people know what the why of things, and your justification for doing things. And then, you know, to continue on that marketing theme is let the customers know. And, you know, where Dirk was saying, if you could do the temperature, you know, checks and so forth, publish that. Let people know that. Put that on your website as to all the different things that you are doing to keep them safe, because there's a lot of anxiety out there. And the more that you can communicate all the things that you are doing to be in compliance with these orders to your employees, and to, you know, help keep customers safe to your customers, the better you are, the better you're going to be off. So, was there another thing that I didn't answer? I kind of got wound up on that.
I guess I would say, as far as your in the field procedures, and actually while we have this break, because Cheryl actually asked a question, and we're gonna have Dirk answer it too, but I really think that Dan, you and Matt probably have more of an insight on this. Should we as contractors be charging fees to our customers for the additional equipment for PPE that we have provided to our technical employees? I mean, there's two ways you can take it, whether as far as you have to be responsible for your own work, your own employees, you have to provide it anyway. Should you adjust your pricing to cover some of these additional charges? I mean, it's not something you can probably add to an invoice and say, just to be safe, we added the PPE and now you have to pay extra $10. I mean, again, there's many schools of thought here, but Dan, what's your insight on that?
The accounting side of me says, yeah, go for it. The customer relations standpoint says you're going to cut your own throat to do that, because people are suffering out there, people are hurting, and you know, this is a time where you want to, you know, be really upfront and stand out about this, that, you know, that you are doing this for them, and that you're not, you know, that people are going to take it as a penalty. I know that's one of the things that, you know, when you put a fuel surcharge on an invoice, that's one of the biggest things that customers hate. And so, you know, if you put a PPE surcharge on your invoice, I think it's going to be something that people notice. So from a, you know, from a customer relations standpoint, I'm not going to do it, and I wouldn't advise that.
Dirk and then Matt. But Dirk, as far as, in my standpoint, just looking at this, PPE is something we're required to do as a service business. And so to be able to pass that charge and yet make it visible like that just seems like it's kind of a slap in the face. But of course, I'm taking this a little bit far, I know. But as far as your take on that, Dirk, what would you say?
I don't see any legal prohibition. I don't see any consumer protection issue there. It is an additional expense if you choose to call it out and charge for it. But certainly, practically, I would err with Dan that it doesn't seem like a very good business move to me in the current environment in particular.
And Matt?
I just think it's a perspective of looking at your costs and seeing if you need to adjust prices, you need to adjust prices. I don't. I mean, we're looking at them all the time as we're going through. I mean, we've seen material prices just go crazy in the last couple of years in different ways. So this is just another piece where we're just loading all those costs in and seeing what it looks like when it comes out. So hey, I hate paying luggage fees and that type of stuff when I go on an airline or pay for this seat or pay for that seat or banks. I just feel like I get nickeled and dimed. So we don't do that for our customers. We just include anything. It's the price is the price, and if we need to adjust it, we need to adjust it. So I think I was going to say just the other thing here is I think we've been given a gift. It's a loan right now, but we have been given a gift in this, and it's how do we want to be generous with pieces of the PPE that we've been given as well, especially when us as businesses can work through this. And, you know, we're using this money to pay for wages that have already been paid for by a customer. So how are we going to use this money to give back? Like Dan was saying earlier, I dumped a bunch into training. That's a great way to be generous with those dollars when we're able to be generous because we're getting income in where many businesses aren't getting any income in at all to be able to do that. So so that another way to be generous is with the PPE too. So
Cheryl, in closing, I would say that as things are still very new, and this is being such a new thing where we're having to get those supplies, having to include that in our costs and whatnot, it's something in the future that we might want to look at as businesses to see where we need to make those adjustments as this becomes the new usual and PPE equipment is part of our overhead. Maybe in the future that's something we look at, but as of right now, it would be kind of a risky move to kind of put that out there on your invoices. All right, so we had kind of talked about as far as some of your stuff, Dan, and we really appreciated some of your feedback as far as how you kind of talked about your employees, how you brought them in, what some of the concerns were. And I know we have a couple more things. We have about 10 more minutes left, so I'm going to try and do this as fast as possible.
Can I
Matt,
jump in and say one thing?
Yeah.
So one of the things, agree a ton with what Dan said, but one of the things that our guys, as we moved through this, that our guys got really frustrated with was screening of our customers, and finding that since we had screened them and then we had gotten to the door, somebody in the house was quarantined or somebody in the house was sick. So we have changed it to where the screening is asked all through the process. It's asked when the call is booked with our customer service rep, as well as when the dispatchers are calling, and then the techs do it again, and they're at the front door, so they're not surprised if something has changed, because it's being sick. It can happen at any time, and we've given our customers, we've written it specifically into our technicians, written it specifically into our plan document, is that if somebody is sick in that home, it's your call whether you want to do that call or not. First off, we want to reschedule if we can. If it can't be rescheduled and it's a essential duty to do it, It's your voluntary position to take, whether you want to enter that call or not. And then if you don't want to do it, then we'll try to see if there's somebody else who wants to volunteer for it. And if nobody wants to volunteer, we can't run the call in that situation. But we've had guys that have stepped up and offered out to do that. But the most recent one we had people getting frustrated was that somebody in the house had been sick, had COVID, and had been over it, and it was a couple weeks ago or that, and the guys find out about it in the home in conversation, and they get spooked and freaked out, and they were just asked, hey, can we know this so that when we go in, it's not a surprise to us. So it's just these things that we learn along the way, and I think all of us are going to learn them and don't feel bad about that we've made a failure here or there. Just communicate with our teams and try to fix them as we go, because there's no playbook for this that we've seen. So
no, that leads kind of into what we're going to talk about next, is the screening, as far as the requirements by the state that we do screening, and currently the system. So Dirk, a little bit more on how important the screening is, and I think we're going to start with Matt after that as far as what you've put in place so far, and then we'll go with Daniel after that.
Yeah, so the screening is explicitly required by Executive Order 2020-114, and minimally it's required that you screen every employee every day or every shift that they report for symptoms of COVID-19. So that's going to be your irregular cough, elevated temperature, gastrointestinal symptoms, elevated temperature, fever. And again, whether or not you do that test for fever in addition versus just asking the question is up to you, but is permissible. But that screen in some form is required at the beginning of every workday or every shift. And that includes people, if you have people who don't report first to the work site, but instead report directly to a customer site, you have to make sure you've got some mechanism in place where you're still screening them or verifying that they're self-screening as part of their workday. And then on top of it now, is Matt was talking about, is you do have the mandatory requirement now that you screen the customer work site as well. So you need to do it for compliance purposes, but also practically speaking, it's probably the single most important thing anybody can do to limit exposure to COVID-19, to coronavirus. We know that people worry a lot about surfaces and touch, which it's appropriate. You need to be safe, and you're required, again, per the executive order, to have a cleaning protocol. Overwhelmingly, the science tells us it's the airborne exposure that is really what's going to cause somebody to contract the disease.
All right, Matt, what have you guys done for Thornton and Grooms as far as screening? What protocols do you have with your office staff and then your field?
So we have not brought our office staff back. Our office staff is still working from home. Although from a mental health perspective, I think we're going to have to bring them back pretty quick. I'm noticing struggles there. The screening, we started out screening was happening with the managers. So each team's manager was getting with each individual employee and working through it that way. Managers still do some in our world, and then our dispatchers do some in our world. And we do not use temperature checks because most of our guys, we're not bringing them into the office. We're sending them from home to home, trying to limit contact that way. And then teams that are working together, we've really tried to limit switching teams up so that we don't get a whole department potentially sick if somebody got infected or somebody needed to go into quarantine, where we just try to keep teams. If it's two-man team, that two-man team has stayed together for the last month and a half or 2 months and tried to keep that way. So that's kind of been the way that we've done it. If anybody has any of those symptoms, has anything else that's different, hey, I think I might have food poisoning, stay home. I think guys are hypersensitive that we're in customers' homes, and customers are going to be hypersensitive if they're sick because they're hypersensitive if customer has anything going on as well. So, so those would be the the 2 or 3 things that we've really narrowed in seem to have worked well for us.
For us, and it's been something that before the requirement was there, I was starting to do it just as something that I could reassure my customers with, that I had kind of referenced in my last bit. But one of the things about that new executive order 2021-14 that it has is a requirement that as employers that we're supposed to maintain a record. So we have to, it's not just enough to ask these questions.
Right.
We have to log it. We have to keep track of it. And so, that's a burden on every business to be able to do that. And, looking at this, we're actually going to be beta testing for starting tomorrow with all of our employees with a product called CertiClear. And what it does is it sends a text message to each of the employees 15 minutes before their shift starts and has all of the questions that when they click the link, they have all of the questions there where they can log their temperature, and then as long as they log all of, answer all the questions in a positive way, on the dispatcher's screen, it gives them a green check next to their name so that they're cleared to be able to go. And if it doesn't, then it leaves them red and actually sends a text to the supervisor and the HR person so that they know, hey, we have to follow through, that there's somebody sick here. And if the person does not respond within 15 minutes to that, it sends another text to them and says, hey, you've got to do this before, that you have to log your responses before you can go on. And then it does a third one another 15 minutes later, and then notifies the supervisor and the HR, that we have a person who's not complying, with our requirements to do this. And one of the cool things about it is that all of this information is logged, kept on a secure server, and it's only exception processing, in which there is nothing that, there's no additional record keeping requirement on, whoever it is that's getting all this information, that it is kept in the, it's exception processing, and it's logged securely. So, it's kind of transparent as far as that goes. That's another thing that I have to go through in my Zoom service meeting tomorrow morning. But in full disclosure, this is a product that Online Access, of which I'm a partner with, has come out with, and it should be available for release next week.
Oh.
That sounds great. The ability to maintain, on the one hand, the record that you've done the screen, but on the other hand, maintaining the privacy of the employees and their data is really the perfect combination that you want.
Yeah, and another thing that, and we referenced it a little earlier, is the liability aspect of this. And this is the biggest thing having to do with, all of this is that, again, you have one political party that's wanted to, kind of absolve businesses and workers as we start back up. And then the other party that's kind of joined at the hips with people who, want to, the trial lawyers, basically. And so, we've got a stalemate there. So as business owners and, for even the employees that I'm going to be communicating with, this is the reason why we have to do this. It's a CYA thing. Mm-hmm. And so, we have to have this information, and we have to be able to keep it secure, and then when we need it, if we need it, that it's there. Now, there is a government program that they've come out with called Michigan Symptoms. However, it's not, it's something that an employee has to go in. They have to log in each day that they go in, and it's kind of cumbersome the way that I've heard it described. I think, Brian, you described it earlier, or Dirk, one of you described it earlier, as how it's going to be expected to work. But the other thing is that the employer has no knowledge of what is going on with their employees' health. And so it's like the government is getting this information with Michigan symptoms, but you as the employer are left clueless as to any of this stuff. So you still have to do all of the record keeping and everything. And so, you know, if something comes up, you don't have a log unless you're keeping adequate records. So it's just kind of a boondoggle that has been created.
Yeah, there was,
Brian.
Daniel, there was a daily update that my office administrator forwarded to me today where I believe that this Michigan government came right out and said that the Michigan symptoms tool will not keep you in compliance with the order. And the recommendation was that the employees do the Michigan symptoms and then hold up their smartphone on the way in so the front desk person can write down if it was red, green, or gray, or you take a screenshot. And so prior to that, our office was looking at that tool and we may back off of it just because of that. It does seem very cumbersome.
Yeah, absolutely.
Dirk, did you have anything to add? I think everybody kind of talked at once, so.
I was just going to, no, I think those are all great points. That the key takeaway from that is you do have to be able to document that you've done the screening, or else you're not compliant, and also you're exposed, because if the situation arises, you can't verify, hey, we did everything we could. And then finally, just also under the piece of the order that speaks to in-home services, to be clear, you also have to be able to carefully document, which I assume you're doing anyway as good business, but you have to be able to document the whole course of that employee's day so they can do tracing if necessary, if at some point, you know, someone comes down with COVID-19. So there are documentation requirements there as for the in-home piece as well as for the employee screening piece.
So we're kind of past our time. We have definitely covered quite a few topics today. And I know that we've had quite a few people actually, you know, on and off throughout the presentation. We have a recording that we're going to share. In addition to that, I'd like to be able to share, if it's okay with you gentlemen, Dirk's information, Brian's information, and Matt and Daniel's. I'm going to give that in an email to everybody so that they can reach out for you for more information, or email you guys if that's something that you guys would be interested in, because I feel like there's probably some more questions. We probably maybe created some more questions possibly. The takeaways from today, I would say, in general, as far as complying with, whether it be your PPP loan forgiveness, track what your usage is. Be aware of where it's being used and be ready to have your reporting at a moment's notice. For the compliance for opening up for your PPE and for your daily business routines for as far as the protection stuff and your screening, you just have to have a system in place. Being able to cover yourself in any kind of act where you're making an employee uncomfortable or maybe somebody else reports you have to be able to backtrack that and be able to present proof that you have done everything within your power to, you know, apply or to abide by these. So with whether you use, you know, your own screening system, whether you use the My System, whether you use any system, make sure you have something in place that's compliant and that it's something consistent and that there's no complacency. That's a big one. So keep that stuff in mind. We're going to follow up with an email, and we appreciate everyone's time today. We have the links on here too, so I'm going to be putting together, like I said, for all the attending lists we have, we'll have the links that we shared today, we'll have everybody's contact information, and we'll have the recording. So again, have a great day. It is 90 degrees outside of Michigan. This is happy weather for contractors, and I hope you guys enjoy the rest of your evening. Thank you for your time.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thanks, Colleen.